Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the Robert Foster Cherry Award Lecture. Each year, Baylor University administers the Robert Foster Cherry Award for great teaching. It's a national competition, and therefore, essentially, this is an award for the best teacher in the United States. They choose 3 finalists. I'm delighted to say that Roger Rosenblatt, Distinguished Professor of English, is one of the 3 this year. Part of the competition requires the finalists to speak not only at Baylor, but also at Stony Brook, so this is that talk at his home institution. In introducing him, I'm going to just talk a bit about the process of nominating him, and I'll read from the nomination letter a bit. When I nominated Roger for this prize, I knew that he was an esteemed teacher and well liked by his students, but I had no idea until the letters started coming in just how treasured he is and how beloved. They normally require only 3 letters from faculty and 4 letters from students. 17 letters came in, all of them of the same tenor, and put together as a whole, considered as a whole, they constitute basically a contemplation of what is distinguished teaching and what is an inspired teacher. So I'm going to read a little bit from what I wrote in the nomination letter that captures some of that. The letters testify to the special gifts that Roger Rosenblatt has given to his students. They note the respect that he shows them and the honesty with which he critiques them. They speak of the sensitivity with which he reaches out to every one of his students, even the most defending, and the sense of safety and confidence that he imparts. Roger guides his students to write from the head and from the heart. He helps them to see and feel what they had previously overlooked, and all these letters, they all witness to the rare relationship that Professor Rosenblatt creates with his students and the sense that he gives them that they can dare to do and be more than they had ever hoped. The letters came from students not only at Stony Brook and Stony Brook, Southampton, but also from Columbia Journalism and from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And one of the administrators at the Kennedy School wrote about the fact that when Roger was there, he had to somehow overcome the policy paper mode of expressing oneself that the students there were used to, and that proved difficult. In fact, Professor Rosenblatt felt he was getting nowhere several weeks into the course. Their writing was wooden, stale, dull, formulaic. He brooded on this, as he seems to do over each student, and came up with one of the bits of inspired teaching that make him qualified to win the Cherry Award. On the day of the breakthrough, he began the class by telling his students he was about to do something that he wanted them to pay attention and to be prepared to write about. He then walked to the heavy wooden classroom door, opened it, stepped out into the hall, and closed the door behind him. He walked back into the classroom to face the group of bewildered faces, and he told them that he was going to do it again. And this time he wanted them to listen as well as watch. He wanted them to see the door close, hear the lock catch, watch him disappear, and then he wanted them to write about whatever came to mind. One began her essay, "In my father's house, there were no doors." She had been raised on a naval base in a trailer, and her essay became about how she had grown up feeling that she did not know her father. One of the students who was gay wrote about his partner leaving him. It was the fulcrum, this event was the fulcrum that moved the whole experience for the class. And he was able to get them from that moment on to trust using their own original language and to express original thoughts. It gave them the freedom and ability to apply that technique using the individual voices that they wanted to address. And it was, in the letter writers and in the referee's mind, great teaching. He had one particularly frustrating student at the Kennedy School. She was the most talented writer of the group and was also the only woman. She was the only woman Marine to have been chosen for hand-to-hand combat in Iraq. As you'd expect, she was aggressive and tough, and she immediately set up herself up to challenge Roger in his effort to get her to write about her singular experience in Iraq. It was clear to him this was the key to opening her writing talent and to bring it to full flower, but she resolutely refused. He worried about it, pondered it, fretted, lost sleep, and then he had one of those insights that set him apart as a teacher. She was a soldier. She needed a top kick, a commanding officer. So he told her to do it, He ordered her to do it. And when he did, she first gave him a piercing, fierce look, and then she seemed about to salute, and she did it. It was a floodgate of both feeling and talent that was released. The letters that came from Stony Brook, from Southampton, from the other institutions, all testified to the fact that Roger transforms his students by giving them other crucial gifts too. One is the realization is that writing comes from your head and your heart. It does not happen on the page. As one of his former students who now writes for the New York Times Magazine put it, that Roger gives constant assurance and constant goodness. 14 years after studying with him, one of his students said, he remains her first reader and her most faithful cheerleader. Another student from Stony Brook, Southampton said, he loves life and he loves his students and he transmits that feeling in the classroom. Professor Rosenblatt made each student feel that he had inspired every other one, said this student. He brought out the brilliance that was always in each of them. In the end, Roger Rosenblatt performs a kind of alchemy. His sensitivity, empathy, and support make every one of his students feel precious and golden. And as one student wrote, when you treat it like gold, it's easy to shine. Professor Roger Rosenblatt talking about you can't teach writing nonsense.
Thank you. I know that many of you are here thinking this is part of Sarah Palin's book tour. I too was disappointed. And I apologize for the voice working its way through this cold. I realized this morning I sounded like the guy from the Men's Warehouse on television. You didn't like the way you look? If you don't like what you hear, place the blame on Baylor University and the Cherry Award Committee, who are wonderful people and have the noblest intentions, but have created a monster. The best professor in America. Given the natural generosity of faculty politics, you may imagine the fate that awaits the winner. I'm going to read you the first chapter of a book I'm writing on the teaching of writing. When I finished this first chapter, unfortunately, I realized that I had said everything that I know about writing, which poses certain challenges for the second chapter. Jasmine, Einur, and Christy took my modern poetry class last term. Nina had the same class with me last year. George, Suzanne, Diana, and Veronique took my workshop in novel writing last spring as well. Of the others in the room, I recognize only Robert, who, besides being a graduate student in our MFA program, owns two of the better restaurants in the area, Robert's in Watermill and the Paradise in Sag Harbor. As soon as I spot him, it occurs that I might inveigle him into holding the end-of-the-year class party at Robert's for free. I mention this brainstorm as I call the roll. He maintains an amused but non-committal expression. Like Robert, Anna, Donna, and Sven have not taken classes with me before and appear both more polite and more apprehensive than the others. I try to make everyone feel as uncomfortable as possible. Why do you want to take this class with me, Jasmine? I asked the 22-year-old. To learn to write like John Donne? She smiles demurely. In last term's modern poetry course, she piped up out of the blue, I don't like John Donne. In 40 years of teaching literature and writing courses, I have never heard anyone say such a thing. Now, this slight, composed, reserved, very pretty African-American graduate student, with the high voice of a little girl, assaults the sacred. He has nothing original to say, she said. I told her, even if that were so, don't you think he gets credit for the way he said it? She looked away, faintly bored. I hated to admit she may have had a point, which will still not prevent me from needling her from now on. This class I called Writing Everything. Students spend the term writing a short story, some poems, an essay, and a one-act play. I concocted the course a few years ago. The original idea was to determine the principal strengths of each of the forms, then see how they might be of use in writing any of the others. Most MFA students plan to write fiction, so I thought they would profit from trying poems to concentrate on original language, plays to concentrate on dialogue, and essays to develop ideas. It turned out those expectations were too rigid, and I learned it was better to say less about the individual properties of the forms and simply allow the students to enjoy writing something different. They sit at the seminar table in a classroom at the Stony Brook, Southampton campus, leaning slightly forward, writing pads before them and pens poised on the chance I might say something interesting. It is the last week of January, the beginning of spring term. The room, a cube trapezium made up of sharp corners and angles, is a little too bright, with one floor-to-ceiling windowed wall and two other large windows that admit the fierce winter sunlight. Even on cloudy days, the white walls and the white tiled ceiling reflect light. The floor is gray with a design of little sand yellow squares. Two long egg box cases of fluorescent bulbs hang from wires 10 feet above the seminar table, also white. The table is composed of four smaller tables pressed together in a rectangle, about 6 by 12 feet. I sit at one end with Christy beside me. I think she has claimed the position for purposes of hectoring. George and Suzanne, husband and wife, sit at the opposite end, with the others arranged 4 on each side of the table. 12 is a very good number for a writing class, as it is for juries and apostles. The chair is some type of plastic or industrial blue. There is one blackboard, green in this case, behind me, and another on the wall to my left. Occasionally you hear faint hammering and the whine of an electric saw from outside, as this, the newest of the Stony Brook University campuses, is still under construction. But the room has a quiet feel, and something about its aggressive sterility works in favor of creative minds. So, here we go again. Another writing class like tens of thousands occurring around the country. While programs in English literature have withered in the last 25 years due to a useless competition of various critical approaches, and also probably to an exhaustion of material, writing programs have burgeoned. When I say withered programs, of course, I'm not referring to the Stony Brook department, which is, as everyone knows, perfect. Between 2003 and 2006, the number of MFA programs nationally jumped from 99 to 145. Since 1975, the number of creative writing programs has increased 800%. It is amazing. The economy has tanked. Publishing favors nonfiction. Young people seem to prefer the image to the word. Yet all over America, students ranging in age from their early 20s to their 80s hunker down at seminar tables like this one in Iowa, California, Texas, Massachusetts, New York, and hundreds of other places, avid to join a profession that practically guarantees them rejection, poverty, and failure. All who have taught in our program, Jules Pfeiffer, Billy Collins, Meg Wolitzer, Matt Clam, Melissa Bank, Robert Reeves, Marcia Norman, Frank McCourt, Luann Walker, Kaylee Jones, Julie Sheehan, Margaret Atwood, Richard Ford, and others, dutifully remind the students of their likely fate. But they come to us in hordes anyway. I look at my dozen hopefuls, a chorus line without a star to support, smart, good-natured, gifted people who hope to forge a life from their imaginations. Can I teach them to become professional writers? No. Can I teach them to write better than they do? Yes. George, you going to stay on the wagon this term? I ask what seems an impertinent question of the 59-year-old man at the far end of the table. His wife, Suzanne, who sits to his left, is a little older than George, in her early 60s. She is slim with a narrow face engulfed in flaming red hair. George has the body of a pro football nose tackle, his girth held in check by his 6'2" height. He dresses mainly in black. The wagon, George? He smiles. Yes, sir. Suzanne smirks. They both know that George's wagon refers to clean, clear writing. George is cursed with an enormous vocabulary, a wealth of arcane knowledge, and wit, some of it gained from his part-time work as a limousine chauffeur to rich and dangerous people. He will make a very good book of this experience someday, but only if he tempers his verbal excesses and keeps his style intelligible. No binges, George. He nods. His problem is a bit unusual, but it falls within a wider, more general category of student mistakes. Most of my students suffer bouts of throat clearing, overwriting, and hesitating, which derive from their not knowing what they mean to say. What is this about? I ask them. What is this about? What is this about? If you can't say what your piece is about, start from scratch. Find someone you trust to ask that question of you when I can't badger you. A friend, a spouse, a lover, a partner, anyone who will be hard on you. What is this about? You'll be happily surprised to find that most of your cloggings and chokings will will vanish if you know what you mean to say. The most common form of throat clearing occurs in the opening of anything, usually a work of prose. So eager are writing students to impress the reader that they are, in fact, writers. They will often tie themselves in knots in order to sound learned or clever, or worst of all, beautiful. About 10 years ago, I hit on a simple exercise that cures throat clearing like a charm, at least for the moment of the exercise. I bring something to class that stimulates one of the senses, a rock to touch, a jazz recording to listen to, a tea kettle, or a similarly evocative object to look at. I ask the students to touch, listen, or see. I ask them sit quietly for a few minutes and allow a thought or a memory to come to you. Once I brought phlox to class, gave each of the students a flower, told them to take in the scent and then follow their noses towards something to write. Many wrote of weddings and funerals they'd attended. One young woman wrote of receiving her first corsage, the awkward boy pinning it to her lavender dress, and to her. Another young woman whose arms were hidden by tattoos and whose eyes looked dead recalled the job she had selling roses at the side of a highway. Men stopped their cars to pick up a bunch or two, she wrote. No one bought roses for me. When I taught a course in essay writing at Harvard's Kennedy School in 2005, the class was full of bright, ambitious world beaters who thought and wrote in orderly ways. At this point, I was about to tell you the wonderful and delightful anecdote that Steve told you in the introduction. This is my way of humiliating Steve and getting on with the lecture. I have a new throat clearing exercise, though, to try on this class, but I will hold it till the end of class. Most of the people here are more advanced writers than the Harvard group, but we all make the same mistakes. I never fail to say we to my students because I do not want them to get the idea that one ever learns how to write, no matter how long or successfully you've done it. You need to remind yourself continually that every word counts, and to take Twain's dictum to heart that the difference between the word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. We are only in the lightning business, I tell them, adding, you need to remind yourself what not to do as well, and to recognize when you've done something effectively for the first time so as not to do it again poorly. I tell them never to hold back, not to husband information and be coy. Spill the beans, I say. It's the only way you get more beans. I tell them not to stretch to find a different word for the sake of difference. Read Hemingway's short stories where he uses the same words over and over, and the words gain meaning with every repetition. If you have somebody say something, let them say it, not aver it or declare it or intone it. Let the power reside in what he says. I tell them to work towards anticipation in their writing, not surprise. From the outset of Hamlet, we are sure the prince is going to buy it. Yet we watch the play over and over, rapt to feel the power of his life before it ends. Anticipation over surprise. Stare at a point of land over which you know the sun is going to rise. And the moon rises instead, and it's a surprise, so what? But stare at the same piece of land over which the sun is going to rise, and the sun rises. My mind. Demonstration of anticipation over surprise to change the context. Mariano Rivera, the closing pitcher for the New York Yankees, is the best closer in history. He throws the same pitch, has thrown the same pitch for all his life. Called a cutter, it's thrown with two fingers next to each other rather than apart on a fastball, and the ball moves to the side. Every hitter who comes up against Mariano Rivera knows that the cutter is coming. There's no question in their mind it's coming. They anticipate it's coming. They also anticipate they will not hit it. It all works out just perfectly. I tell them to favor imagination over invention. Invention is easy. A three-eared camel who speaks French and studies diplomacy is one thing. But a real camel, humped with the eyes of a diva, is really strange. I tell them to value form, which often rescues content. You know, this movie WALL-E, the animated robot. I love WALL-E. And WALL-E, at the beginning of the movie, finds a box. And in the box is a ring. He looks at it, he takes the rings and tosses it and keeps the box, because the box is cooler than the ring. It's more worth one eye. The poet Richard Wilbur said, the strength of the genie comes from the fact that the genie is contained in a bottle. Form. I tell them to write their pieces as they would write their lives, with restraint, precision, generosity toward every point of view, including the evil ones. and in the service of significant subject matter. All this, I tell them, is readily forgotten and must be continually relearned. MFA programs are supposed to be professional schools akin to business, law, or medical school, but they are really schools for amateurs. Is that me? No, it's okay. That's better, that's you. I love the little tunes in these phones. Keep us going throughout the day. Schools for amateurs. With everything you write, it's as though you've never written a word before. Edgar Doctorow, who sometimes teaches in our program, describes his novel writing process as driving at night and seeing only as far as the headlights illuminate. This feeling of perpetual newness and disclosure keeps you from learning a craft in the commonly used sense of learning. But it offers at least as many thrills as anxieties. The throat-clearing exercise usually produces thrills. Instead of stalling at the top of the slope, thinking about how to present themselves to the readers, students hurtle down, pleasantly surprised with what has come to mind. For the teacher, the process of recurrent learning staves off adamancy. You don't want even your most cherished ideas about writing to puddle and harden into orthodoxy. Every good rule of writing I can come up with presents exceptions which may or may not prove the rule. As a writer, I would never lock myself into set patterns. It would be foolish and misleading, not to say boring, to do so as a teacher. How do you tell the lightning bug from the lightning, asks Anna. If you're going to write, I tell her, you must think about words more seriously than you ever have. Learn to pick your spots, to choose when to use ordinary language and special heightened language. But every word must be the only word for its place and must function in every way, not just adequately. They show me blank faces. Okay, I say. Here's a quotation from a T.S. Eliot poem, Sweeney Erect. I go to the board and write, Sweeney addressed full length to shave, broad bottom, pink from nape to base, knows the female temperament, and wipes the blank around his face. When I get to the last line of the quatrain, I indicate a missing word. What's going on in these lines, I ask them. They talk about a man shaving in preparation for an evening out. What picture do you get of this man, I ask. They conclude that he is lecherous, animalistic, full of himself. Does he drink, I ask. They think so. Champagne or beer, I ask. They think beer. Anything else about him? Some suggest that Sweeney is a wild man, uncontrolled, a big ape. So he's comic, I ask. Yes, they say, but darkly comic. Is he mad, I ask. They think possibly. I take my seat again. With this picture in mind, I say, what word is missing in the last line, and wipes the blot around his face? Has to be a word that makes sense in terms of what Sweeney is doing, and that satisfies the impression you've taken of him. Lecherous, comic, beer drinking, out of control, possibly mad. They consider for a moment. Cream, says Robert. Good, I say. Cream connotes lechery, and it fits with shaving, but that's all that gives us. Foam, says Suzanne. Better, I say. Foam gives us madness in beer, but not the dark comedian. They brood about several possibilities. The right word, the lightning, in this instance, has to pack everything in. Yet, as you figured out, it has to be simple, one syllable. Suds, says Nina. I clap and give her the thumbs up. And why did Eliot use suds, I ask? Because of the lechery, the comedy, the potential madness, and the beer. That's the lightning, says Anna. Ain't it, I say. I have a good feeling about this class. I'm going to like them. Liking a class is more useful and practical than it sounds. In a likable class, discussions are freer, more open. The students feel safe with one another, and they can always unite against me. This year's group comes from very different backgrounds and are widely different in experiences and in ages. All this should make them more interesting to themselves. I remind them that they comprise the only audience of readers they need worry about for the present. They will read one another's work and comment on it. I want them to know you'll never have a situation like this again. Writing is a lonely enterprise. Here, in these classes, you have colleagues, people in the same boat who wish you well. I tell them to be severe and exacting in their comments. I'll never let you be harsh, I say, though I doubt you ever would be. And I promise, in all my years of teaching, I have never had to referee a fistfight. This is a half line. Some years ago, I had a really good student writer, a kid from the streets who was built like a frozen roast and rode to work or to school on a Harley. He could not take criticism and fought with me over every correction I made on his work, beyond the point of reason. Years later, he sent me a letter allowing I may have been right about a thing or two. But there was one class meeting where things got so hot between us, we nearly came to blows, which would have been very bad news for me. Ainur's family, originally from Uzbekistan, settled in Pakistan, then emigrated here. She is 24, Muslim, beautiful, and a terrible reader of her own work. Every sentence turns up in a Valley Girl question. I kid her about this without mercy, but it doesn't help. Suzanne was reared in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn in a neighborhood of Quonset huts and still has Brooklyn in her voice. Born to an Irish non-religious family, she became a practicing Catholic on her own. George grew up in a German Catholic community. A year and a half ago, while tracing his lineage, he learned his family was Jewish. In the 1930s, they had converted for self-protection. Of course, we're Jewish, relatives told him casually at a family gathering. Everyone knows that. Sven, 33, was reared by his mother, an Austrian. His father from Norway died when Sven was 2. Sven is reserved, solid, the kind of guy you want on your side. After graduating from the Air Force Academy, he spent 5 years as an Air Force pilot flying C-17 cargo planes into Iraq and Afghanistan. As a kid, he studied art. John Dunn, hating Jasmine, grew up in Babylon, Long Island. Went to Stony Brook as an undergraduate, and by her own admission, has had no experience in anything. Her mother is from St. Lucia, her father from Hempstead. Anna, 71, was born in London and reared in Argentina before her family moved here. Her father was a UN diplomat. She speaks with an aristocratic intonation, but is no snob. She went to Smith. Christy, who also grew up on Long Island, plays the flute, works on a farm stand. At 22, she bubbles with life, loves to recite the Jabberwocky, asks questions unremittingly, and describes herself inaccurately as my biggest pain in the ass. And there is 54-year-old Robert, whose solemn expression accompanies a sardonic sense of humor. His family is rooted in Long Island. He has worked in the restaurant business since leaving Queens College and writes articles on golf on the side. And Diana, 23, who was a varsity gymnast at SUNY Cortland. Bright-eyed with black hair and a clear, clipped way of speaking, she is 5 feet tall and boasts that she can high jump 4 feet 8 inches. She is working on her first novel, begun with me last term. And Nina, 57, who went to Bucknell, got her MLS at NYU and became a librarian. Her mother was Swiss, her father Italian, was the son of a Pennsylvania coal miner. Nina took care of her parents at the end of their lives. In the modern poetry class, she wrote a brilliant paper on Seamus Heaney in the form of a parody of a Heaney poem. And Veronique, who went to American University and is a former photojournalist for the New York Post. Her parents came here from France, and she grew up speaking French. Her fellow students know her to be gracious and kind. And Donna, 49, who majored in philosophy at Stony Brook, got her degree while her 3 children were growing up. As a young woman, she worked for Izod and Ralph Lauren. She sketches and gardens. She wants to write essays on the environment. Her husband sells golf balls. Writing students look different from other students. No matter how old they are, they have a childish romanticism to them, as do professional writers, sometimes self-destructive, but touching. Anna, sophisticated as she is, has the face of a young girl about to take in her first Broadway show. George, big as he is, looks like a puppy, eager for approval. Who among them will turn out to be the better writers? Who will show a voice like no others, an original stance, a different way of apprehending the world? And who will have the patience and stamina, the seriousness of purpose, to make the most of his or her gift? Who will recognize that writing is hard labor, work? When I started teaching writing courses as the Briggs Copeland instructor at Harvard, there were students in my class whose successful future seemed assured because they had both talent and will. Frank Rich, Mark Halpern, I hardly taught them as much as I stood back and cheered. Yet there was one young woman, the tomboyish daughter of a federal judge, who was better than a lot of them, born with perfect pitch of language and the quiet authority of Ann Tyler. Like Tyler, too, she had something to say. Yet, for whatever reasons, she did not want to be a writer. Writing was just something she did well. Years after she studied with me, I bumped into her in a supermarket in Cambridge. "Did you keep up the writing?" I asked her. She shook her head without apology. "You were my most talented student," I said. She smiled and shrugged. 4 forms, I tell my new class. We'll start with a short story, which we'll be due in 2 weeks. After that, you'll write some poems, an essay, and a 1-act play. For the plays, I've arranged to hold the classes in Avram, the campus theater. You'll all act in one another's plays. Christy asked me, "What parts will you take?" "I'll be the audience," I say. "Try to keep me awake." Don't forget to make copies of your work for everyone in the class. For you too, asked Diana. I smiled tolerantly. If we're going to begin with a short story, says Anna, could you tell us the difference between a short story and, say, a novella or even a novel, other than length? A novella is essentially a long, short story with a little more happening in it usually, but a novel is quite different, I say. A novel, being the broad canvas, gives you the development of things, of characters, of action, of theme. The business of a short story, on the other hand, is usually over by the time the story begins. That is, you know the character and his or her situation from the opening. You even know what's likely to happen. The story is about why what you know matters. It pleases me when they ask basic questions such as what's a short story, because basic questions force me to slow down and consider things part by part. Many years ago, I had an undergraduate, an engineer, who did not know what a story was. So steeped was he in math and science, he could not comprehend the fact that he had seen stories every day and had been living them all his life. Once we began, he felt out of his depth and wanted to quit the class. But I urged him to stick it out. His natural lack of sympathy with the subject made him useful to every discussion, like an annoying character in a play who says over and over again, "I don't get it." When he would question the simplest idea, I had to backtrack before we moved on. What's character, he would ask. What's a motive, a character trait, a crisis? What's irony? I don't get it. That's ironic. At the end of the term, he wrote a complete short story. Nothing great, but the parts were there. I doubt if my engineer ever wrote one again, but for the time I knew him, he was my most valuable student. When this class gets to writing their personal essays, I know they will ask what the difference is between an essay and a short story. And I'll tell them that an essay deals with something that really happened. And they'll ask, can a short story be about something that really happened? And I'll say yes, but in fiction, you treat facts differently. You dream into them and make them works of art. And they will say, but there are beautiful personal essays that give us an artistic feeling. And we'll go back and forth like that, and compare examples of each form and understand why the pig or the moon a writer has imagined is different from the one he's actually seen. And I will tell them what Shelley said in his defense of poetry, that we must learn to imagine what we know. We must learn to imagine what we know. And that applies to fiction and essays as well. And the discussion will be painstaking. But in the end, we'll be grateful for the original question that led us to examine the essential elements of both forms. It can't be too clear, especially when trying to teach a subject as murky and as intuitive as writing. The poet Tom Lux, who was taught in our summer program, told his students that poetry is mixed feelings expressed clearly. I hand out copies of James Joyce's story Clay from the collection Dubliners. I do this often. Give students the best examples of what they're doing themselves, not to offer models, but to remind them that good readers make good writers, and vice versa. Our program requires students to take literature courses along with courses in writing. I asked them to look at the first sentence of Clay about the main character, Mariah. Practically all you need to know about Mariah and her story is in that first sentence, I say. How much information, pure information, is given by Joyce in that sentence? I asked them, count the facts. They studied the sentence. The sentence is, the matron had given her leave to go out as soon as the women's tea was over, and Mariah looked forward to her evening out. The students come up with 8 items of information regarding Mariah's station in life, where she works, what she does, what she's about to do, and hints of who she is. What about the name, I ask her. She has no last name, says Nina. And what does that tell you, the thing that isn't there? I ask. Nina says that she has no family. And what does that mean? I ask. That she's alone, says Veronique. And if she's alone, without a family, without even a family name, what does that mean, I ask? That Mariah is unimportant, said Nina. Yes, 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 I say. And since we know that Joyce would not write a story about someone unimportant unless she was important, we know that this is going to be a story that shows us the Mariah, perhaps all the Mariahs, whom people fail to see. I add, and it's all in the first sentence. Be very careful with beginnings. Be compelling. Suggest urgency. Readers are impatient. You have to grab them by the lapels right away, like the ancient mariner with the wedding guest, and tell them that nothing in their lives matters as much as listening to your story. See Joyce's little trick here, I tell them. He's saying, if Mariah is looking forward to her evening out, you should too. It's going to be quite an evening. And it is. When I dive into an idea like this one, it always feels new to me, though I have said the same things about Clay to classes at least a couple of hundred times. I lose myself in the story. No matter how familiar it is, I worry about it all over again, and the students overhear me worry about it. In this, I am unconsciously imitating teachers I admired when I was a student. At Harvard, John Kelleher, professor of Irish studies, worried anew about Joyce every year, as did Douglas Bush, the great Renaissance scholar, about John Milton. Teaching takes a lot of wheedling and grappling, but basically it is the art of seduction. And observing a teacher who is lost in the mystery of the material can be oddly seductive. A recollection comes to mind of teaching clay to undergraduates many years ago. In the class was a young black woman from one of the Caribbean islands who was shy and spoke with a musical lilt. The worlds in which she grew up and that of late 19th century Irish James Joyce seemingly could not have been farther apart. And as far as I could tell, she had very little practice analyzing a work of literature. But she raised her hand. This line on page 1, she said, about Maria slicing the barmbrack bread so finely and evenly that one cannot see the places where the knife has cut. Isn't that what Joyce is doing, creating the character of Maria? You can't see the cuts. So often had I taught clay that under hypnosis I could probably recite it from memory. But I never heard anyone say what that young woman said. Do you know, I told her, that you probably noticed something about the story that's not only right, but has never been noticed before. She smiled. The class smiled. I smiled. I tell my new group of students, some of you will teach as well as write. Moments like that one are the reason you'll do it. Sven asks, if beginnings of stories are supposed to grab you, are they like journalism? I grimace. Those who know me also know that I hate the intrusion of journalism when we're talking about real writing. But yes, I answer, newspaper stories and fiction are alike in that, seeking your attention immediately. So are plays, especially one actors. Something about the characters or the setting has to attract you right away. And poems too, says Donna. Absolutely, I agree. Whether the poem is the long form of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, or Go and Catch a Falling Star. Who wrote that line, Jasmine? I forget. She will not deign to answer. Funny about beginnings, I go on. They seem arbitrary. You have a story with 1,000 possible doors, and you choose one at which to enter. Even scientists had to pick a moment to decide when the universe began. Pick it out of a hat, somewhere between the tick and the top. And yet, as arbitrary as they are, beginnings often contain everything in the piece in truncated form. This is true of other arts as well, of music. The overture and the magic flute, complicated as it is, compresses every element of the entire opera. Of course, the artist may create this compression only after he has finished the work, realized what it's about, then made an adjustment back at the beginning. I think Fitzgerald did that with Gatsby. But just as often, we sense that somehow the writer knows where he or she is going, even if the full meaning of the story has not yet revealed itself. And the beginning contains all that, hidden in code, like a cipher. Do you want us to read more than the first sentence of Clay? Asked Diana. I ignore the chuckles. Good idea, I say. Read all of Clay for next week and get a hold of Salinger's A Perfect Day for Banana Fish and The Laughing Man. We'll talk about them too. Robert and others indicate they know the banana fish story well. We know a lot of these stories as readers, I tell them. Now we're going to look at them as writers, try to determine the various decisions great writers make. This may be another reason writing programs are overtaking programs in literature. To read like a writer is more intimate, puts you closer to the process. You enter literature from a new door. Of course, there's another reason. Unlike PhD students in English, MFA students are actively encouraged to steal from their subject matter. Any reason you're beginning with a short story? Asked George. There is, I tell him, and I launch into a mini lecture on the centrality of the story in all writing. I point out that stories are everywhere. In the law, where a prosecutor tells one story and the defense tells another, and the jury decides which it prefers. In medicine, where a patient tells a doctor the story of his ailment and how he felt on this day or that, and the doctor tells the patient the story of the therapy, how he will feel on this day or that, until one hopes the story will have a happy ending. Politics, he who tells the best story wins, be it FDR or Pol Pot. The myths of business, the foundations of religion, the greatest story ever told. I tell them everything they write here is a story. Fiction and plays tell stories, and so do essays and poems. An essay is the story of an idea, a poem is the story of a feeling. We start with a story because it is basic to human nature, I say. It is like a biological fact, an inborn insistence. The Jews, in the last days of the Warsaw Ghetto, they knew perfectly well what was going to happen to them. They had seen their families taken away to extermination camps, and they themselves were dying of starvation and diphtheria. And yet they had the strength and the will to take scraps of paper on which they wrote poems, fragments of autobiography, political tracts, journal entries, and they rolled these scraps into little scrolls and put them in the crevices of the ghetto walls. Why? Why did they bother? With no news of the outer world available to them, they assumed that the subhumans of the so-called master race had inherited the earth. If their scraps of paper were discovered, the victors would laugh at them, read and laugh, and tear them up. So why expose their writing, their souls, to derision? Because they had to. They had a story to tell. They had to tell a story. I tell them about Jean-Dominique Bauby, the French editor of Elle, who suffered so massive a stroke that the only part of his body he could move was his left eyelid. And yet, with that eyelid, he signaled the alphabet. And with that alphabet, he wrote an autobiography, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And about the skipper of the mackerel schooner in The Perfect Storm, who wrote a message by lantern light as the ship was going down. And about the messenger in the book of Job, who had a story to tell. And Melville's Ishmael, who alone was left to tell the tale. We like to distinguish ourselves from other animals by saying we're a rational species, I say. That's sort of a commonly shared joke. But a narrative species, that one can prove. They're beginning to wonder why I'm spending so much time on this subject. And yet, I go on. If stories lie at the center of experience, indispensable to our being, there still must be those people responsible for telling them. Those self-elected few who are the chief storytellers and keep the race alive and kicking. And do you know who those people are, I ask. They stare at me surprised. Someone says, us. I sing them Happy Birthday to You. They give me the he's gone nuts look. I've come to cherish it for years. I sing it again, Happy Birthday to You. I ask them, anyone had a birthday recently? Anyone about to have one? 2 or 3 raise their hands. I choose Sven. Let's all sing Happy Birthday to Sven. He looks less pleased than confused. Now here's what I'd like you to do, I say. Hear the song Happy Birthday in your minds and start to write your short story. Don't wonder if when you're alone the story doesn't pan out. For the moment, just sit back and see what comes of listening to this irritating, celebratory song you've heard all your lives. I sing it again. Now write. I watch them lean back for a minute or two, then lean forward and go at it. The classroom is still, save for the motion of their hands on paper. This is how we begin. Thank you.
Questions?
No, I don't know Sarah Palin personally, but I've admired her a long time.
I'm just wondering when your book will be ready to be published.
This one? If I can figure out about to say in chapter 2, I'll certainly let you know. I'm supposed to finish it by March and probably a year from then. That's usually the schedule.
Question?
Sure.
What's the greatest lesson you ever learned from a teacher?
Well, one was certainly to know your subject. The fellow I mentioned, John Kelleher at Harvard in Irish Studies, I wasn't interested in Irish Studies. I became very interested in Irish Studies, but I didn't know anything about it. He was, in fact, at the time I took a first course with him, he was teaching 18th century poets. His politics were antipodal to mine, very conservative, very severe in his judgments. God, you wouldn't want to be on his bad side, I'll tell you. But you look at certain teachers and you know you have the goods. And he was so imbued with the subject. He grew up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, an Irish-speaking town. He went to Dartmouth on a scholarship, boxed a little, learned so much about Irish literature and history that when he came to Harvard, he was made a member of the Society of Fellows, which meant he could leave all the degree-getting nonsense, and he was given a chair in his late 20s. And that's how much he knew about his subject. And so he was a wonderful man, generous, and just decent through and through. But it was the knowing of the subject that impressed me. And I must tell you that when I say that, I think I've only learned my subject in the last 10 years. That I started to teach when I was 22. You can imagine how impressive I was. And my students were 4 years younger. I used to have, my friends used to open the door of the classroom while I was teaching and hurl in the National Enquirer just to rattle me, which wasn't necessary. I was rattled enough. But I learned a little more and a little more and a little more. I wanted to be a writer, and so when I left university to become a writer, although I always went back because I liked teaching, but when I became a writer, I started to learn the subject more. I never really learned to lecture. I can do it here by reading something, and once in a while I can pull it off. But I'm much better with a smaller group, whom I can torment. I like that. I like the sight of their little faces. But learning the material. Yes?
What would make you decide to use a play to tell a story?
Use a play to tell a story? Well, if I wanted to make sure that a story could be told by people talking to one another. Plays are interesting. You write a play, you have two characters talking to each other, you think you might have something. Throw in a third character and then you have a play. I've never gotten that far, by the way, as a playwright. I've never been able to do it. But the people never really talk to one another. They always talk to someone else. You know, you're not talking to me now, you're talking to them. I'm talking to them while pretending to talk to you. But this is the way it is. You know, whether you're talking to your wife, you're not talking to your wife, she's not talking to you. I'm sad that she's not talking to you. But the fact that they do not talk to each other means they must be talking to say something interesting, which they themselves find something interesting. You put those people in combination, and that is a way of telling a story. When you maybe you're telling a Beckett story or telling an O'Neill story. It's the story that is told by people speaking to the air. Yes, ma'am? In the back.
You changed your style of teaching since your 20s, and what made you change?
Decrepitude, largely. I didn't have any style of teaching. My style of teaching was total fear. I taught the first course in African American literature at Harvard. These were in the political 60s. And the naive department thought that they would list the course as what was called a conference group, which is 30 or 40 students. So I show up in the class for the 30 and 40 students, and 780 students show up, naturally, because not that they were interested in literature, but because this was a political thing. So, speaking of learning to lecture, what I did was I would give a lecture, run home, and I mean run home, to try to stay one day ahead of the class, and then come back and teach the course. The more I learned about my subject, the better my style, so-called, became, in answer to your question. I developed the style only by accident. The style was because I'm comfortable with what I say, and I wish the students well. That is no small thing. Most teachers I know, Spector, Manning, Shekel, my colleagues and friends, all wish the students very well. We are, for all our kidding around, driven basically by a generous impulse. We want to see things because we raise the water that way. So that's where our influence goes. And that then becomes one style. In the back, yes.
You just mentioned the author of Diving Bell and Butterfly. We also know of other authors who have written with their toes.
Who have what, sorry?
Who have typed with their toes and published.
Yes, exactly.
And it is interesting to notice that most of them have written autobiographical works. And my question is, to motivate my students in the classroom, would you not agree with me that there is a possibility that they may feel that they want to bring in more into their papers if they're given the opportunity to write a personal narrative and which can...
I think so. I think the caution you want to do is remember, you only want to write a memoir if you have something to remember. And when students are as young as our students generally are, I wouldn't encourage it because for two reasons. One, it won't work. And the other is that at a later point, when it would be more useful to them, they may feel confined or constrained by the earlier attempt. But this doesn't, I quite agree with you. To get them to reach for something in themselves when they write, even if they discard it, gets them to the place where only the writing will matter. And anything you can do to do that. That's why I do that throat clearing thing. You know, anything you can do to do that, I think, will work. Yes.
When you or someone starts to write a new piece, what do you think is the most important thing for a writer to remember? Or to
For when you write, what's the most important thing to think about? There's a lot you don't think about after a while. Either if you are doing it right, style and things like that come to you. Although styles change depending on what you write. I think not enough attention is paid to subject matter. I think people should strive for significant subject matter, to write something that is useful to others, useful emotionally, useful philosophically, useful historically, useful some way, at some standard, so that you're not just simply chatting to pass the time. And if you are not persuaded that what you're writing is going to be useful to others, I'd write something else. And you can do it well. I mean, the trick about writing is it's like faking it when you play the piano. It can sound great, but it really won't be there. It won't be the real thing. Hang on, since you asked one before. Yes?
What inspired you to teach, and what keeps inspiring you to teach?
I didn't want to rely on my father for any more money for school. And in those days, it's an interesting world. Some of my friends here remember that world. I literally said, when applying for a scholarship when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I said, I no longer want to rely on my parents for my education, and that was enough. You can imagine, that was a different world, but they said fine, and so gave me the scholarship. I guess I can't really think of it. You know what I think of? I think it was an honor more than a vocation. The better students were teachers when they were graduate students. I wanted to be considered a better teacher. I was glad to get the job. All of these things were kind of vain and silly. God knows what I taught them. The only thing I ever got out of teaching at that age was one of my students, who was Bill Fitzsimmons, who later became the Dean of Admissions at Harvard. And he actually thought I knew something. So I am very, very useful to my friends when their kids are applying to. But I'm careful about it, because if I get profligate, then he'll catch me. But that's the only thing I can remember really doing well, winning the admiration of William Fitzsimmons. Yes.
Well, you'll have my admiration if you can answer this. You have my admiration. I've been a writer for 30 years and a teacher of writing for 3 months, unless you consider stints of editing various newspaper magazines. I've always considered good, clear writing to be good, clear thinking. Therefore, in view of the title of your lecture, how do you teach students to think clearly?
It's a wonderful question. I hope I win your admiration with the answer. My students, some of whom are here, they were checked for arms at the door. My students will attest that I badger them over and over again to say what they mean. And when I don't do it, I encourage them to get others to do the same thing, to be very, very clear about what you're saying. What is this about? What is this about? What I said in the beginning here. It's wonderful to hear that question. It's challenging, it's upsetting, it's wonderful, it's enriching. And until you can say it, you don't have the piece. You know that as a writer. Until you can say it. Once you say it, suddenly you say it. This is about. And we spent a lot of time on that in class. Just the clarity of the idea. I don't know that I'm teaching them to think clearly. I mean, I am encouraging them, perhaps teaching them, to look for clarity as a standard. So we all like fancy writing, but I am a real believer. I mean, Keats said, "Load every rift with ore." I don't have enough ore. I don't have enough rifts, actually. I like clear writing, choosing its spots for that one moment where you can say something that nobody would have thought of saying, and then go on. But tell the story. Be clear. The power, I think, comes from clarity. Yes.
For some reason, I would love to know what you think of Oprah Winfrey's book club.
Would that I got in it. There isn't a writer around. I mean, you can hear all the bullshit around that. That's I wouldn't be taught dead. I would be running, screaming towards Oprah and her book club. I think it's great, actually. For whatever knocks she has suffered from time to time, she's the most prominent public figure imaginable who has spoken in behalf of books, with some exceptions, one of which was W.'s wife, who was very good about the same thing. All the boats rise, and I think it's always good to have. And I think the book club has probably done a great deal of good, just encouraging reading, especially in a world that discourages.
What place or value do you think creative writing like stories has in more traditional English lit classrooms? Usually we write analytical papers.
I like both. I know Steve, who has done a really masterly job in running our department, is now at a crossroads. It's all us who teach in the department are, what to do with this subject. I mean, it is hard. English literature, when Peter Banning and I studied it, was the bee's knees. Everybody got into English literature. It was the greatest thing possible. Now, it seems an absurdity that would be the first thing that one would think of majoring in when one enters a university. And that's a challenge to the teachers. But I think one way to meet the challenge is for some fusion of creativity and reading. When I teach my modern poetry course, it's a straight literature course. But in the middle of doing nothing else, I say, write a love poem, preferably to me. Write a love poem. And I tell you, you would be surprised how good they are. I mean, really good. I don't mean just good for this, but good, objectively good poetry. And it springs, And then when they go back to the love poems of Lowell, or the love poems of Bishop, or the love poems of E. Cummings, it's different because they've been there. And I think departments would flourish with some fusion of creative work and the interpretation of the books.
Do you ever dislike a student's work, and if so, how do you handle it?
Only yours, Marilyn, and I ignore it. Sure, I dislike it. Dislike in the sense that I think it's not as good as it could be, that kind of thing. But, there's an advantage of not being as precise as science. You can actually, move the things around and make something sound a little better and a little better. The trick is to get the student to understand why it got better, so that he or she will do a little better. But not everybody in the class is a born writer. Hardly that, actually. There'd be no purpose in teaching if everybody was already there. Yes, sir?
Since you brought up science, what do you think your type of writing teaching has to offer science writers?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I would love science writing to be part of, the question was, what does this sort of teaching offer science writing? I would love science writing to be part of our program, and it's good, and it's hard to find good writers writing about science, but when you do, it's gold. And I think we are in the process of getting someone who has been terrific doing it. The wonderful thing for us about finding a first-class writer to write science, to come back to clarity, is that they explain worlds that seemed absolutely removed from us before, without cheapening it or lowering the standards or anything else. They just make something. I think I speak from most of my colleagues. We are most enthralled with the things that we don't understand, have no idea of, and often many of those subjects are scientific. Yes.
The other day on the radio, I was driving back from Westchester, and I was on the Frog's Neck Bridge, and there was a lot of traffic and such. Who was it? The Symphony Clyde. I can't think of his name, but he writes American symphonies. He writes these American. Anyway, but the symphony was a symphony for clarinet, and he was using every trick in the book to make this symphony interesting, surrounding the instrument of the clarinet. And it just occurred to me that I wasn't giving him the benefit of the doubt as I was listening to it. I was just being very critical as a listener, and yet he kept on swirling it out somehow, and moving it away from where the light was, and moving it over here, and just pushing it over here, and doing some of this and doing some of that, and then raising it and lowering it, and all these kinds of things. And it just seems like it was something that he could have ultimately put together simply by taking his time and putting every little trick he technically knew of to make it interesting and to make a symphony. And the reason I with that big introduction, the question I had is it possible to write something greater over time than it is at any given time, as long as you keep whipping the batter, or keep, whatever.
Many great works of literature were put down and taken up again later. And often when you write, you don't know where it's going. But he didn't know where the clarinet was going. He just knew that he had it, and he knew that the sound it made. It's a wonderful moment in writing where it runs ahead of you. It can't run too ahead of you, because you've got to, eventually the rational mind says, I know it must end here. But between that moment of mystery and that moment of ending is absolutely wonderful. It's the reason most people write. You are lost in the wonder of words just moving on. Words attached to thoughts, attached to feelings, moving on. Characters do things you never expected them to do. You write a word that you've never used before. Where do these things come from? It is at these moments it's worth a life.
Yeah, could I push you just a little bit on the question of journalism? And I thought about it when you said about science writers making things clear. From my point of view, some of the New York Times, Natalie Angier and Jane Brody, it seems to me that they are writing clearly or explaining to me.
They are, and it's Natalie Angier. I taught her.
Oh, you love that. Well, that's why she's good.
My wisecrack about journalism has to be alloyed by the fact that I was in it for a long time. I just don't want people to think that simply telling a story, that is, Natalie's in a different category, and a lot of people, including myself, were in catbird seats when we were writing. But simply telling a story actually delimits the mystery I was mentioning before, because you have to get to a point in the story, and the editor, if you don't get to that point, the editor will say, what are you writing, what do you want them to know, and so forth. My objection to journalism as studied in universities is I don't want it confused with the courses that I'm talking about. I really don't. I think nobody profits from that, and but as a trade, it's an admirable trade, and at its best, a noble one. And Natalie does very well. I haven't seen her in a long time. Does very well. Yes, in the back.
Earlier on you said, in response to a question, that the trick was basically to get the student to see why writing a particular way is better. Now, would you mind sharing with us some of the tricks that you use to help the student to see why writing a particular way is better? Because yes, they do see sometimes that what they wrote originally.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just as plain as can be. That little business about giving them something to look at, or some piece of music to hear, or that kind of thing. As soon as the memory comes in and they write something, particularly that Harvard group that Steve so cruelly referred to, depriving me of such a wonderful anecdote. Oh, I'm sorry, I seem that group was as dull a group as you could possibly have, because they were all out to run their own countries, which they are probably now. And I was hauled in to try to do something different with them. And when I did hit that door closing thing, suddenly the young woman who wrote "In My Father's House There Were No Doors," who was a marine scientist, so you could see her head snap up, and she said, "Oh, that's where I live." And where if you can see that, then they begin to do the real thing. It took a while to develop that trick, but I'm glad I did it. Yes.
You've mentioned, and just by your way of speaking, that mentoring and being on on a, face-to-face small groups, immediate feedback, or maybe over the course of the semester, we've seen that there are thousands and thousands of more people interested in writing at all these different levels and different ages, and yet the numbers of things that are published and kind of the amount people are reading just seems to be a little bit more contracted these days. If the purpose is to rise all boats, as you mentioned before, is there a way to kind of almost like virally spread your word, like through like
I think virally.
media, for example?
I like the idea of my word spreading like a virus.
Well, like,
dropping
I'm
like
talking about
flies.
the, like for the future, like we have this large population, everybody needs to become more literate. How can you, one person, and you are doing it.
I can't.
But, like using the other kinds of techniques in like
Look,
social networking kinds of
quite
things.
seriously, all of us here are very grateful to the Baylor people for establishing a prize for best professor in America. If they are tasteless enough to choose me, I assure you that I'm not the best professor in America. There are thousands in my own department, as good or better. Thousands of people who do it all the time. And a teacher cannot tell where his or her influence stops. And it's not a matter, it's not an evangelical thing. It's quiet teaching of quiet people in a quiet setting, little by little, doing some good. I couldn't possibly tell you how it would be done on a grander scale. I really just, it's not, I don't think it's to be done on a grander scale. Yes?
I teach engineering undergraduate labs, and we have course called writing in engineering. So students writing reports in their lab. And I have no time to analyze these reports and tell what's wrong, what's right. Enough time, let's say. How to make students aware what they write. Sometimes it's maybe a grammar correct, but it's incomprehensible, right? How to make them aware, how to, I don't know, make them write their own writing and understand what they can do.
I really don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to see it to.
Okay.
You remind me of an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm recently, where Larry, who's the most absurd person in television, says to Funkhauser, another absurd person, "Oh, I didn't mean that," And Funkhauser said, "You never make an empty promise to a Funkhauser." So I'm sorry I said anything like that. The engineer, painter, rabbi, makes no difference. They all do other things. They read other things. The standards that they apply to the other things that they read might be applied to the papers that they write for you, so that clarity, force, humor, even in engineering, humor, might be the things that make their pieces worthwhile. I think it a lot has to do with your standard for what constitutes a good piece. You may say that I want a piece from you that absolutely gets across the nature of this event, experiment, discovery, and so forth. If that's your sole standard, then you can't complain that the writing isn't lively. If, on the other hand, you want to give them something a little more in this, so that they not only become writers of pieces of engineering, but also writers to the world about engineering, just as we talked about science before, then I think the same standards that I was talking here apply. Clarity, original language, imagination. If you learn to imagine what you know, imagine all the things the engineers know.
But when you just wrote something, you still have in your mind what you're trying to say. So you're not actually reading what you wrote, you still remember what you're trying to say. So when, for me, the only thing works, I put it away and read it a bit later, and I see it's not what I want to say. So basically, how to make students to understand that their writing is not
I'm no good to you. If I could, this is obviously an empty offer because I have no intention of looking at one of your students' papers. If hypothetically I could do this, I would have to be able to answer your question more intelligently. But until then, I'm afraid I can't.
Last question.
Do you still write pen to paper, and how do you feel about the change in technology going to?
I'm all for technology. I'm just crazy about it. Yes, I write with my little big pen on my legal pad, and then I type it up on my electric typewriter, and then I give it to my assistant who puts it into the 21st century. But I do my part very slowly and very in a very rudimentary way. You want to start up? You want to do something about it? That's just my way. Thank you all very much.